The crimson droplets against pristine white snow formed a trail that spoke of desperation and dying hope, each scarlet stain growing larger as Miles Brennan urged his horse forward through the bitter January cold of 1877. He had been tracking the Cortez gang for 3 days across the mountains near Lewiston, Idaho, but this blood was fresh, still steaming in the freezing air, and something about the pattern told him this was not the blood of a fleeing outlaw. The snow fell heavy around him, thick flakes that would soon cover the trail entirely, and Miles knew that whoever was bleeding out ahead of him had minutes, not hours, before the mountain cold claimed them forever. His breath formed clouds in the frozen air as he dismounted, leading his horse carefully along the blood trail that wound between towering pines. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying with it the promise of a blizzard that would make these mountains impassable by nightfall. Miles had been a cowboy for most of his 26 years, working cattle drives from Texas to Montana. But 6 months ago, he had pinned on a deputy's badge in Lewiston after the Cortez gang had murdered the town's sheriff during a bank robbery. The rage he felt that day had transformed him from a drifter into a man with purpose, though he wondered now if that purpose would lead him to freeze to death in these God-forsaken mountains. The blood trail led around a massive boulder, and that was when he saw her. A woman lay crumpled in the snow, her dark hair matted with blood, her dress torn and soaked through. She was not moving, and for a terrible moment Miles thought he had arrived too late. Then he saw the shallow rise and fall of her chest, the faint mist of breath escaping her blue-tinged lips. He ran to her side, dropping to his knees in the snow, his hands already reaching for the wound he could see on her side where blood pulsed steadily through her fingers. "Madam, can you hear me?" His voice was urgent but gentle as he carefully moved her hand aside to assess the damage. A bullet wound, clean through her left side just above her hip. The bleeding was severe, but the bullet had passed through, which meant he would not have to dig it out. "Stay with me now. I am going to get you out of here." Her eyes fluttered open, gray as storm clouds, filled with pain and confusion. "They left me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I told them about the law coming, and they shot me and left me to die." Miles shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shivering body, then tore strips from his shirt to bind her wound tightly. The fabric darkened immediately with blood, but the pressure would slow the bleeding enough to get her somewhere warm. "Who left you?" "The Cortez gang." She nodded weakly, her teeth chattering. "I was with them, not by choice. They took me from a stagecoach 2 weeks ago. When I heard you were tracking them, I tried to warn them so they would run, so there would not be killing. Antonio Cortez did not appreciate the warning." "That sounds like Cortez," Miles said grimly as he scooped her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, her body trembling violently from cold and shock. "Can you tell me your name?" "Sarah," she managed. "Sarah Rothman." "Well, Sarah Rothman, I am Miles Brennan, and I am going to make sure you live through this day." He carried her to his horse, a sturdy roan gelding named Copper who stood steady despite the growing storm. Getting her into the saddle while keeping pressure on her wound required careful maneuvering, but Miles had spent his life working with horses and injured cattle. He climbed up behind her, holding her against his chest with one arm while the other guided Copper back down the trail. The nearest shelter was an old trapper's cabin he had passed an hour back. It would take precious time to reach it, time Sarah might not have, but trying to make it back to Lewiston through the blizzard that was now unleashing its full fury would guarantee both their deaths. Miles urged Copper into the fastest pace the horse could safely manage on the snow-covered trail, feeling Sarah's blood seep warm against his shirt, feeling her body grow more limp with each passing minute. "Stay awake, Sarah," he said close to her ear. Talk to me. Tell me about yourself." "So cold," she murmured, her words slurring. "Cannot feel my hands." "That is the cold, not the wound. Your hands are going to be fine." He held her tighter, trying to share his body heat. "Where are you from? How did you end up on that stagecoach?" "Philadelphia," she said, the word coming out slowly. "Was coming west to teach school in Lewiston. Got hired through a letter. My parents died last year, cholera, and there was nothing left for me there." "I am sorry about your parents," Miles said, and he meant it. He had lost his own mother to fever when he was 12, his father to drink 3 years later. "Lewiston is a good town. They need teachers. My friend's daughter just turned 6 and is eager to learn her letters." Sarah did not respond, and Miles felt panic spike through him. "Sarah, stay with me. Tell me more about Philadelphia. What was it like?" Her eyes opened slightly. "Crowded, dirty, beautiful churches though. I loved the bells on Sunday mornings." Her voice was fading. "Am I dying, Miles Brennan?" "Not if I have anything to say about it." The cabin appeared through the swirling snow, a dark shape barely visible in the white storm. Relief flooded through him. "Look there, shelter. We are almost there." He dismounted carefully, keeping Sarah in his arms, and kicked open the cabin door. The interior was dark and frigid, but it blocked the wind. Miles laid Sarah on the floor near the fireplace, then quickly unsaddled Copper and led the horse inside. The cabin was large enough to accommodate the animal, and Copper's body heat would help warm the space. Miles had stayed in enough line shacks and mountain cabins to know that survival sometimes meant unconventional choices. With Copper settled, Miles turned his full attention to Sarah. She had lost consciousness, her face pale as the snow outside. He built a fire with shaking hands, coaxing the flame to life with kindling and wood left by whoever had last used the cabin. The fire caught and grew, casting dancing light across the rough-hewn walls. As soon as the flames were established, Miles filled a pot with snow to melt for water and turned to Sarah's wound. The makeshift bandage was completely saturated. He removed it carefully, relieved to see the bleeding had slowed to a steady seep rather than the dangerous pulse from before. The wound needed to be cleaned and properly dressed, and he needed to get her out of her wet, frozen clothing before the cold killed her where the bullet had not. He had delivered calves, set broken bones on fellow ranch hands, and once stitched up a friend who had been gored by a longhorn, but this felt different. Sarah was not just another injured body. She was a woman who had survived captivity by outlaws, who had risked her life trying to prevent bloodshed. And something about her courage called to something deep in his chest. Miles worked efficiently, warming water over the fire and using his cleanest cloth to wash the wound. Sarah stirred and cried out in pain as the hot water touched torn flesh, but she did not fully wake. He found a tin of salve in his saddlebag, meant for treating cuts on horses but clean enough for this, and applied it generously before binding her side with strips torn from a blanket he found in a chest by the wall. Then came the harder task of getting her out of her wet dress. He kept his eyes averted as much as possible, respecting her modesty even in unconsciousness, working quickly to preserve her dignity while saving her life. He wrapped her in his coat and every dry blanket he could find, then positioned her as close to the fire as was safe. The cabin was warming slowly, the fire throwing welcome heat into the small space. Miles checked Copper, rubbing the horse down and covering him with a saddle blanket, then finally allowed himself to sit beside Sarah and take stock of their situation. The storm raged outside, wind screaming around the cabin's walls. They were trapped here until it passed, which could be hours or days. Miles had some jerky and hardtack in his saddlebag, enough for a day or two if rationed carefully. There was wood stacked along one wall, enough to keep the fire going for several days. Water was plentiful in the form of snow. They could survive here, but only if Sarah made it through the night. Blood loss and cold were a deadly combination. He checked her wound again, relieved to see only slight seepage through the fresh bandage. Her breathing was shallow but steady, her face still far too pale. Miles added wood to the fire and settled beside her, monitoring her condition through the long hours. He dozed fitfully, waking every few minutes to check on her, to adjust her blankets, to feed the fire. Sometime near dawn the wind finally began to ease. Sarah stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. Miles was at her side immediately, offering her water from his canteen. She drank greedily, coughing slightly, then focused on his face. "You are real," she said, her voice hoarse. "I thought perhaps I dreamed you." "I am real enough," Miles assured her. "How do you feel?" "Like I was shot and left to die in a snowstorm," she said, and there was a hint of wry humor in her tone that made Miles smile despite everything. "But alive, which is more than I expected. You lost a lot of blood. You need to rest and recover your strength." He helped her sit up slightly, propping her against his saddle. "Are you hungry? I have some jerky, not exactly a feast, but it will help." Sarah accepted a piece of the dried meat, chewing slowly. Her eyes took in the cabin, Copper standing in the corner, the storm still visible through gaps in the walls. "You brought your horse inside." Seemed practical. "His body heat helps warm the place, and I was not about to leave him to freeze." Miles tore off a piece of jerky for himself. "The storm should break today. When it does, I need to get you back to Lewiston. That wound needs a proper doctor." "The Cortez gang," Sarah said suddenly, her eyes widening. "They are headed for the Canadian border. Antonio said they would cross over and the law could not touch them there." Miles nodded slowly. "That was their plan before they shot you. Do you know which route they were taking?" "North through the Bitterroot Range. There is a pass Antonio used before. He said it was hidden and the law did not know about it." Sarah met his eyes. "Are you going after them?" "That is my job," Miles said, "but getting you to safety comes first." "They killed people in that bank robbery," Sarah said quietly. "I heard them laughing about it around the campfire. They killed a man who tried to stop them, and they killed the sheriff when he came after them." "Sheriff Morrison was a good man. He was also my friend." Miles stared into the fire, remembering Tom Morrison's infectious laugh, his dedication to keeping Lewiston safe. "I pinned on a badge the day after they buried him. Told myself I would bring the Cortez gang to justice or die trying." "You should not die trying," Sarah said, and there was something fierce in her voice. "You saved my life. That matters more than revenge. It is not just revenge, it is justice." But Miles looked at her and saw the concern in her gray eyes, and something shifted in his chest. He had been so focused on hunting the Cortez gang, on avenging Tom Morrison, that he had forgotten there were things worth living for beyond vengeance. "But you are right that getting you to safety is the priority now." They spent the day in the cabin as the storm gradually subsided. Miles kept the fire going and checked Sarah's wound regularly. The bleeding had stopped completely, and though she was weak, her color was improving. They talked to pass the time, and Miles learned that Sarah was 23 years old, that she had been teaching at a small school in Philadelphia before her parents died, that she loved reading and had brought 3 precious books with her on the stagecoach. Those books had been in her bag when the Cortez gang took her, and they had burned them for kindling one cold night just to torment her. "I cried more over those books than I did over most of the hardships," Sarah admitted, "which probably makes me foolish, but they were a connection to my old life. One was my mother's poetry collection." "That does not make you foolish," Miles said. "It makes you human. We all need connections to hold on to." He found himself telling her about his own childhood, about growing up on a ranch in Texas, about learning to rope and ride before he could properly read. "I was not much for schooling," he admitted, "which is probably why I ended up a cowboy instead of something respectable." "Being a cowboy is respectable," Sarah said firmly. "And you became a lawman to honor your friend. That shows character, or stubbornness." But Miles found himself smiling. There was something easy about talking to Sarah, something that made the cold cabin feel warmer than the fire alone could account for. He was drawn to her strength, to the way she had endured captivity and betrayal, and a bullet wound without losing her sharp wit or her compassion. When he looked at her, he felt something he had not felt in years, something that went beyond simple attraction to touch something deeper. By the next morning, the storm had fully passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Miles helped Sarah to her feet, supporting her as she took careful steps around the cabin. She was weak but determined, insisting she could manage the ride to Lewiston if they went slowly. Miles fashioned a sort of cushion for her from blankets and lifted her carefully onto Copper's back before mounting behind her. She leaned back against his chest, and Miles tried to ignore the way his heart beat faster at her nearness. The ride to Lewiston took most of the day. The snow had transformed the landscape, covering familiar trails and making navigation difficult, but Miles knew these mountains well enough to find his way. Sarah dozed against him, waking occasionally to point out a landmark or share a memory. By the time the town came into view in the valley below, the sun was setting, painting the snow gold and pink. Lewiston in 1877 was a town on the edge of civilization, a collection of wooden buildings clustered along the Clearwater River. It had been founded during the gold rush of the 1860s and had survived the boom and bust to become a respectable settlement with a sawmill, a general store, 3 saloons, a church, and about 200 permanent residents. Miles rode straight to Doc Henderson's house, a neat cottage on the edge of town. The doctor, a gruff man in his 50s with more experience treating gunshot wounds than he liked to admit, took one look at Sarah and ushered them inside. "Another victim of the Cortez gang?" Doc Henderson asked as he helped Miles settle Sarah on the examination table in his surgery. "This one they shot themselves when she tried to warn them about the law," Miles said. "She has been their captive for 2 weeks." Doc Henderson's expression darkened. "I will take good care of her, Miles." "You look like you could use some rest yourself. When did you last eat a proper meal?" Miles realized he could not remember. "I will get something at the boarding house. Send word if there is any change in her condition." "I will." Doc Henderson was already examining Sarah's wound, his skilled hands gentle. "You did good work with this bandaging, Miles. Probably saved her life." Miles met Sarah's eyes across the room. "She saved her own life by being strong enough to hold on. At the boarding house, Mrs. Chen, a Chinese woman who had come to Lewiston during the gold rush and stayed to run the best establishment in town, took one look at Miles and insisted he eat before he did anything else. She set before him a plate of roast beef, potatoes, and vegetables that tasted like heaven after days of jerky and hardtack. While he ate, word spread through town that he had returned with the woman the Cortez gang had taken. By the time he finished his meal, half the town seemed to want to hear the story. Miles gave them the basics. He had been tracking the gang, found Sarah shot and left for dead, brought her back to town. He did not mention the long night in the cabin, the talks they had shared, the way something had kindled between them. That was private, something just for them, and besides, Miles was not even sure Sarah felt the same pull he did. She had been through an ordeal. Perhaps what he had interpreted as connection was just gratitude on her part. He visited Doc Henderson's house that evening, and found Sarah resting comfortably in a real bed, her wound cleaned and properly dressed. She smiled when she saw him, and Miles felt that now familiar skip in his chest. "Doc Henderson says I was very lucky," Sarah told him. "He said another hour in that cold and I would not have made it." "You are tough," Miles said, pulling a chair close to her bedside. "Tougher than most men I know." "I do not feel tough. I feel like I survived by sheer chance and your stubbornness." Sarah reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm. "Thank you, Miles. You could have kept tracking the gang, but you stopped to help me. That means everything." Miles looked at their joined hands, then at her face. "I could not have left you there. Would not have, even if I had known stopping would let the gang escape. What will you do now? Keep tracking them?" "I need to report to the town council, tell them what you told me about the gang heading for Canada. They will decide whether to organize a larger posse or alert the authorities up north." Miles hesitated. "But honestly, Sarah, I find myself less interested in chasing outlaws than I was a few days ago. Finding you changed something." Sarah's gray eyes searched his face. "Changed what?" "My priorities, I suppose." Miles felt suddenly awkward, unused to speaking of feelings. "I have been so focused on revenge, on bringing Morrison's killers to justice, that I forgot there are other things worth living for, worth fighting for. And now," Sarah's voice was soft, "now I am sitting here thinking that I would rather make sure you recover fully than chase ghosts through the mountains." Miles squeezed her hand gently. "Is that foolish? We barely know each other." "I think," Sarah said slowly, "that sometimes you can know in a moment what others take years to figure out. I knew when I woke in that cabin and saw you tending the fire that you were a good man, maybe the best man I have ever met. And I knew that I wanted to know you better, wanted to see where this feeling between us might lead." "You felt it too then," Miles said, relief flooding through him. "I thought perhaps it was just me, or that you were just grateful." "I am grateful," Sarah admitted. "But this is more than gratitude. This is something I have never felt before, something that scares me a little because it is so strong so fast." Miles leaned forward, resting his forehead gently against hers. "It scares me too, but I have learned that life is short and uncertain. When something feels right, you should hold on to it." "This feels right," Sarah whispered, and then Miles was kissing her, a gentle press of lips that sent warmth cascading through him. When they broke apart, both were smiling. Doc Henderson cleared his throat from the doorway, and Miles jerked back, embarrassed. "Sorry to interrupt, but Sarah needs rest. You can come back tomorrow, Miles." Miles stood reluctantly. "I will be back first thing in the morning." "I will be here," Sarah promised, her eyes dancing with happiness despite her exhaustion. Over the next week, Miles visited Sarah every day. Doc Henderson kept her under observation, making sure the wound healed properly and that no infection set in. The town council decided to send word to the federal marshals about the Cortez gang's escape route, but agreed that organizing another posse in winter would be futile. Miles was relieved. He had been prepared to ride out again if duty demanded, but his heart was no longer in the hunt. His heart, he was discovering, was in Doc Henderson's spare room, with a gray-eyed woman who made him laugh and think and want things he had never wanted before. Sarah recovered quickly, her natural resilience aided by youth and good care. By the second week, she was walking around town, still favoring her injured side but growing stronger daily. The town had rallied around her, the women bringing food and clothing, the men tipping their hats respectfully. Everyone knew her story, how she had survived the Cortez gang and tried to save lives even at risk to her own. The school committee approached her before she was fully healed, asking if she still wanted the teaching position. Sarah accepted immediately. The schoolhouse was a one-room building near the church, and it served about 15 children ranging from 6 to 14. Sarah threw herself into preparing for her new role, and Miles helped her, carrying supplies, fixing a broken window, building shelves for the few books the school possessed. "You are good with your hands," Sarah observed one afternoon as Miles finished installing the shelves. "Have you ever thought about doing something other than cowboying and law work?" "I have thought about settling down, buying some land, maybe raising horses," Miles admitted. "But it always seemed like something for the future, when I was older and tired of wandering." "And now?" Sarah asked, echoing their conversation from the first night. "Now I think the future is something I want to start today." Miles set down his hammer and turned to face her fully. "Sarah, I know this is fast, probably too fast by any normal measure, but I am not a man who believes in wasting time. I care about you, more than care. I think I am falling in love with you, and I want to know if you might feel the same." Sarah's smile was like sunrise. "I do feel the same. I have been falling in love with you since that moment in the snow when you told me you were going to save me. And I kept falling every day since, watching you be kind and strong and good. Yes, Miles Brennan, I am falling in love with you, and I want to see where this takes us." Miles crossed the schoolroom in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, mindful of her still healing wound. "I do not have much to offer. My deputy's salary is not large, and I have been living in a room at the boarding house. But I will work hard, I will provide for you, and I will love you with everything I have." "That is all I need," Sarah said against his chest. "Money does not matter. Things do not matter. This matters. Us. Together." They were married in March as soon as Doc Henderson declared Sarah fully healed. The ceremony took place in Lewiston's small church, with what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Sarah wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew, and Miles wore his best suit, brushed clean of trail dust. Reverend Jacobs, who had buried Sheriff Morrison and seen too much death in his ministry, spoke movingly about new beginnings and second chances. When Miles slipped a simple gold band on Sarah's finger and kissed her as his wife, he felt like the luckiest man alive. They moved into a small house on the outskirts of town, a 2-room cabin that Miles rented with plans to eventually buy. It was humble, but Sarah made it a home with curtains and wildflowers and the sound of her laughter. She started teaching at the school, and Miles continued his work as deputy, though increasingly he talked about leaving law work to focus on the horse breeding idea that had taken root in his mind. The Cortez gang was captured that spring by federal marshals near the Canadian border. Antonio Cortez and 2 of his men were killed in the shootout, the rest taken into custody. When word reached Lewiston, Miles felt a sense of closure but not the satisfaction he had expected. Justice had been served, but it felt distant, no longer the driving force of his life. His life now was Sarah, their home, the future they were building together. In May, Miles resigned as deputy and used his savings to buy 20 acres of land with good grazing and a stream. He built a barn with help from men in town who remembered how he had saved Sarah and brought in the Cortez gang information. By summer, he had bought 3 mares and a stallion, good stock with strong bloodlines, and begun the work of breeding horses. It was hard work, demanding long days and constant attention, but Miles loved it in a way he had never loved cowboying or law work. This was his and Sarah's, something they were building together for the future. Sarah continued teaching through the spring term, but by summer, it became clear she would need to take a break. She was pregnant, expecting their first child in early winter. The news filled Miles with a joy so profound it frightened him. He had never imagined himself as a father, had never let himself think that far ahead, but now he could think of little else. He worked tirelessly on the house, adding a second room for the baby, making sure everything was safe and comfortable. "You are going to be a wonderful father," Sarah told him one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Her hand rested on her growing belly, and Miles covered it with his own, feeling the flutter of life beneath. "I hope so. I did not have the best example growing up." Miles thought of his own father, a bitter man who had drowned his grief in whiskey. "But I know what I want to be, patient, present, the kind of father a child can count on." "You will be," Sarah said with certainty. "You are already those things. You have been my rock through everything, Miles. You saved my life, and then you gave me a life worth saving. A home, a purpose, love. I could not ask for more." "I feel the same," Miles said, pulling her close. "That day I found you in the snow, I thought I was on a mission to catch outlaws. Turns out I was on a mission to find you, to find this life." Everything led to that moment. Their son was born in December of 1877, during the first snow of winter. Doc Henderson attended the birth, and though it was long and difficult, both Sarah and the baby emerged healthy. Miles held his son for the first time as dawn broke over the mountains, and felt tears stream down his face. They named him Thomas, after Sheriff Morrison, with the middle name of Samuel after Sarah's father. Thomas was a healthy, loud baby who demanded attention and gave endless joy. Miles proved to be exactly the father he had hoped, rising in the night to walk a fussy baby, changing diapers without complaint, singing off key lullabies that made Sarah laugh. The horse breeding business grew slowly but steadily, and by the time Thomas was walking, Miles had sold several horses to ranchers throughout Idaho and even into Montana. Money was tight but sufficient, and more importantly, they were happy. Sarah returned to teaching when Thomas was 2, bringing him to the schoolhouse where he played quietly in the corner while she taught older children their lessons. The arrangement worked well, and Sarah loved being able to continue her work while still being with her son. Miles continued to build their horse herd, gaining a reputation for fair dealing and quality animals. In 1880, Sarah became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and in the spring of 1881 they welcomed a daughter. They named her Clara Margaret, and she had her mother's gray eyes and her father's dark hair. Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, insisting on helping with everything and appointing himself her protector. The years flowed into each other, marked by the rhythms of seasons and family life. The children grew, the horse herd expanded, and the little cabin was eventually replaced by a proper house with 4 bedrooms and a wide porch. Miles built most of it himself, with help from Thomas, once the boy was old enough to hold a hammer. Sarah's school became known throughout the region for its quality, and students came from miles around to learn from the teacher who had survived the Cortez gang. On winter evenings, the family would gather around the fireplace, and sometimes Miles would tell the story of how he met Sarah. The children never tired of hearing about the blood trail in the snow, the desperate ride to the cabin, the storm that had forced them together. As they grew older and understood more, they appreciated the improbability of it all, how close they had come to never existing because their mother had nearly died in those mountains. "You ever think about what would have happened if you had not found me?" Sarah asked Miles one night after the children were asleep. They were in their bedroom, comfortable in the bed they had shared for years, her head resting on his chest. "I try not to," Miles admitted. "The thought of a world without you in it is unbearable. But sometimes I do think about how everything had to align perfectly. If the snow had been heavier, I might have missed the blood trail. If I had been an hour later, you would have been gone. If the cabin had not been there, we both might have frozen." "Fate," Sarah said softly, "or Providence. Whatever you want to call it, I believe we were meant to find each other. All the pain, all the hardship, it led to this, to us, to our children and our life together. I used to think I understood what I wanted from life, Miles said, stroking her hair. Thought it was adventure, justice, maybe a bit of glory. But what I really wanted was this: you, a family, a home, roots. And I thought I wanted to escape my grief, to run away to somewhere new and bury myself in work, Sarah said. Instead, I found a reason to live fully again. You gave me that, Miles. In 1885, their third child was born, another son they named Daniel Jacob. By then, Thomas was 7 and already showing promise with horses, able to gentle a colt with patience beyond his years. Clara was 4, sweet and studious like her mother, already reading at a level far beyond her age. Daniel completed their family, a boisterous baby who grew into an adventurous toddler who kept them all on their toes. The horse ranch had become one of the most successful in Idaho. Miles employed 2 full-time hands and several part-time workers during busy seasons. They had 30 brood mares, 4 stallions, and usually 20 to 30 young horses in various stages of training. Miles's reputation for breeding sound, intelligent horses with good temperaments spread throughout the West, and he had orders backed up for months. Sarah continued teaching until Clara started school, then decided to focus on her own children's education along with writing. She had always loved words, and with Miles's encouragement, she began writing down the stories of the old-timers in Lewiston, preserving the history of the gold rush and early settlement days. Her articles were published in papers throughout Idaho and Montana, and she became known as a historian and storyteller. The 20th anniversary of the day Miles found Sarah in the snow fell in January of 1897. Their children were grown, or nearly so. Thomas at 19 working full-time on the ranch and courting a girl from town. Clara at 15 and already planning to attend normal school to become a teacher like her mother. And Daniel at 11 showing signs of his father's stubborn determination, combined with his mother's quick mind. Miles and Sarah took a rare day away from the ranch and rode up into the mountains where he had found her. The old trapper's cabin was still there, weathered but standing. They went inside, and it was like stepping back in time. The same fireplace, the same rough walls, though everything was dusty and abandoned now. 20 years, Sarah said wonderingly. It feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. Best decision I ever made following that blood trail, Miles said, pulling her into his arms. They stood in the center of the cabin where he had tended her wound, where they had talked through that long night and started falling in love. Best thing that ever happened to me, being found by you, Sarah said. Though I would not recommend getting shot as a way to meet your future husband. Miles laughed, the sound echoing in the empty cabin. No, I think we can agree there are better ways, but I would not change a single thing about our story, Sarah. Not the danger, not the fear, not even the pain. It all led to us, to this life we have built. They stayed in the cabin for an hour, remembering, before riding back down to the ranch and the family and life they had created. That night, with the children gathered around, Miles and Sarah told the story again. But this time they continued past the rescue and the recovery to talk about all the years that followed. About building a home and raising a family, about the challenges and joys, about love that deepened with every passing year. The thing about your mother, Miles said, looking at Sarah across the dinner table with eyes that still held the wonder of that first meeting, is that she saved me as much as I saved her. I was lost, chasing ghosts and revenge when I found her in that snow. She gave me something to live for beyond anger and duty. She gave me love and purpose in this family. And your father, Sarah added, smiling at their children, gave me hope when I had none left. He showed me that even in the darkest moment when I thought my life was over, something beautiful could begin. Everything I survived, all the fear and pain, it was worth it because it brought me to him." Thomas raised his glass. "To parents who found each other against all odds and built something amazing." They all toasted, and Miles looked around the table at his family, at the strong young man his son had become, at his bright daughter with her mother's determination, at his youngest boy already showing signs of the man he would be. He looked at Sarah, still beautiful to him, gray now threading through her dark hair, laugh lines around her eyes that had not been there when he found her bleeding in the snow. "I love you," he said to her, the words as true now as they had been the first time he spoke them. "Today and always." "I love you too," Sarah said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "My cowboy, my rescuer, my partner in everything. Thank you for following that blood trail. Thank you for not giving up on me." "Never," Miles said. "I would search through 1,000 blizzards to find you again." The years continued to pass, measured now in grandchildren rather than children. Thomas married his sweetheart and gave them 2 grandsons who loved the horses as much as their grandfather. Clara attended normal school and returned to teach in Lewiston, eventually marrying a banker and giving birth to twin girls. Daniel, restless like his father had been, spent several years cowboying throughout Montana before returning home to help run the ranch, eventually settling down with a widow who had a young daughter. Miles and Sarah grew old together, their hair silver, their hands gnarled by work and weather, but their love unwavering. On quiet evenings, they would sit on their porch, holding hands and watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, and remember that day in the snow when their lives had collided and changed forever. In the winter of 1915, Miles fell ill. The doctor said it was his heart, worn out after 64 years of hard work and hard living. Sarah nursed him through those final months with the same fierce determination she had shown in surviving the bullet wound that had brought them together. She read to him, talked with him, held his hand, and made sure he knew every moment how deeply he was loved. "I am not afraid," Miles told her one evening in early spring. He was in their bed, growing weaker by the day, but his mind was still sharp. "I've lived more than I ever expected, loved more than I ever imagined possible. You gave me 38 years of happiness, Sarah. That is more than most men get in 3 lifetimes." "Do not talk like you are leaving yet," Sarah said, though tears streamed down her face. "We still have time." "Some," Miles agreed, "but not enough. There is never enough time when you have found what we found." He squeezed her hand weakly. "Promise me you will keep living, Sarah. Keep writing, keep spending time with the grandchildren, keep finding joy. Do not spend your remaining years just mourning me." "I promise to try," Sarah said. "But Miles, you are my heart. Half of me dies with you." "Then live for both of us with the half that remains," Miles said. "And know that every moment we had, every day from that first moment in the snow to this one, has been the greatest gift of my life." "I love you, Sarah Brennan. I will love you beyond this life and into whatever comes next." "I love you too," Sarah whispered. "My cowboy, my hero, my everything." Miles Brennan died on March 15, 1915, surrounded by his wife, his children, and several grandchildren. He was buried in the Lewiston Cemetery on a hillside overlooking the valley, with a simple stone that read, "Miles Brennan, 1851–1915. Beloved husband, father, grandfather. He followed the blood trail and found love." Sarah lived another 12 years, staying active and engaged with her family and community. She finished her history of Lewiston and saw it published to great acclaim. She taught 2 of her granddaughters to read and helped Daniel expand the horse ranch to be the largest in Idaho. But every January, she would ride up to the mountains to the old cabin where Miles had saved her life and started their story. She would sit in the dusty space and talk to him, telling him about the grandchildren, about the ranch, about how much she missed him and how grateful she was for every moment they had shared. When Sarah died peacefully in her sleep in 1927 at the age of 73, she was buried beside Miles. Her stone read, Sarah Brennan, 1854–1927. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, teacher. She survived to love and be loved. Their story became legend in Lewiston, passed down through generations. The ranch continued under Daniel's management, then his children's, remaining in the family for decades. The cabin in the mountains eventually collapsed under the weight of snow and time, but the story of what happened there lived on. It was a story of survival and courage, of love found in the most unlikely circumstances, of two people who had saved each other and built a life that mattered. The blood trail in the snow had led Miles to Sarah, but it had also led both of them to something greater than themselves. It had led to family and legacy, to love that endured beyond death, to a story that would be told as long as there were people who believed in the power of fate and the strength of the human heart. What had started with violence and desperation had transformed into tenderness and joy, proving that even in the darkest moments, hope could survive, love could bloom, and two wounded souls could find healing in each other. Their great-great-grandchildren still live in Idaho, some on the land Miles and Sarah built their life on, others scattered throughout the West, but connected by the story of their ancestors. Every generation learns about the cowboy who followed the blood trail and the woman who refused to give up, about love that conquered despair and built something lasting. It is a story that reminds them that sometimes the greatest adventures start with an act of compassion, that sometimes the most profound love begins with a moment of desperate courage, and that the trails we follow, even when they are marked with blood and pain, can lead us exactly where we need to be. Miles and Sarah's story was one of the Wild West, but it was more than that. It was a story of human connection, of choosing love over vengeance, of building rather than destroying. In a time and place known for violence and hardship, they created something beautiful. They created a family, a home, a legacy of love that echoed through the decades, proof that even in the harshest landscapes, tenderness could take root and flourish. The mountains where Miles found Sarah still stand. Snow covered every winter, beautiful and deadly. Somewhere up there, beneath layers of fallen needles and decades of growth, there might still be traces of that old cabin, that place where two lives intersected and changed forever. And if you believe in such things, perhaps on cold January nights when the snow falls heavy and the wind howls through the pines, you can still feel the echo of that desperate ride through the storm, still sense the warmth of the fire in the cabin, still hear the whispered promises of two people falling in love against all odds. That is the power of their story, the reason it endures. Because it reminds us that love is worth fighting for, that compassion matters, that the choices we make in critical moments define who we are and who we become. Miles chose to follow the blood trail instead of continuing his hunt for the outlaws. That choice saved Sarah's life, but it also saved his own soul, redirecting him from a path of vengeance to one of love and creation. Sarah chose to warn the gang about the pursuing law even knowing it could cost her. A choice that nearly killed her, but also revealed her character and brought her to Miles's attention. Their story is a reminder that we are not just the sum of what happens to us, but what we make of those happenings. Sarah could have let her ordeal destroy her, could have returned east broken and afraid. Instead, she stayed in Lewiston, built a life, raised a family, and became a beloved figure in the community. Miles could have let his friend's death turn him bitter and consumed by rage. Instead, he found a way to honor that loss by choosing life and love over endless pursuit of revenge. In the end, that is what their story means. It means that even when we are wounded and bleeding in the snow of our lives, someone might follow our trail and find us. It means that even when darkness seems overwhelming, dawn will come. It means that love, when we are brave enough to embrace it, can heal wounds we thought were mortal and build futures we never imagined possible. The cowboy followed the blood trail and found the woman before she bled out, and in saving her, he saved himself. Together, they built something that mattered, something that lasted, something worth remembering. And that, in the end, is all any of us can hope for. To love and be loved, to build and create, to leave the world a little better than we found it. To be remembered not for how we died, but for how we lived and who we loved along the way.